Hey guys, welcome back to Digital Artcast. Thanks again for tuning in for another episode. It's always great to have you guys here. I hope again, due to the continuous lockdown, that you guys are keeping busy and working on any projects that are keeping you sane at this point. I know this is quickly getting to a way of life that we're having to get used to, but hopefully there is light on the horizon, some kind of goodness that's coming towards us that means that, you know, we might get a chance to resume our normal lives at one point. On today's podcast episode, you know, I always talk about, nearly every episode, that I've been so lucky, I think, the last year to speak to so many different people from different walks of life and different disciplines, including some of my personal heroes. And along that trail, I definitely get the honour to speak to some people I thought I would never get to speak to. Today is exactly that. It is a conversation I'm about to have with someone I consider a living legend, someone who is an artist in his own right, but has not maybe focused on the visual sides of things, but more audio again. You know, previously we've had a couple of guys on, like Darren Cobb from Supergiant, who's worked on all these great games as an audio director, and today I get to talk to another great audio director and just composer in general, someone who's come on and gave up their time, and I'm very honoured that he's here. So if you guys could please welcome along today's guest, Mr. Peter McConnell. Hey, Peter.
Hey, Gordon. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. It's an absolute honour to have you here, and thanks for giving up your time. It means a lot to me.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So I think this is definitely on the level of, you know, some of the highest, you know, or highlights that I've had on the program. I definitely think, you know, I think I actually probably reached out to you on Facebook to connect. I think shortly after Psychonauts 2 was announced, just because, you know, you've had such a legacy, and I think it just kind of pinged me at the time to remind me that I was wanting to speak to you at one point about your legacy, the work you've done so far, not just with Tim and his studio or with other guys in the Lucas family, but also just the scope of stuff you've done in general across all mediums. Because you've worked on quite a number of titles at this point. You've kind of had the grace to kind of leave your fingerprints on some really legendary projects. So I'm hoping today would be a great insight for not only me, but from audience and obviously people that are also looking to maybe follow in your footsteps and get involved in the audio industry. So yeah, I think it'll be a good talk. I think it'll be a good time, a good chat. So yeah.
Well, it all comes from surviving all these years.
Yeah, the life that is a freelance composer. Yeah, it's got to be difficult in this climate. But then, of course, I've been told during the pandemic, especially, that games are booming. So I'm hoping that you're getting kept busy at least, or at least there's work coming in that's keeping you, you know, steady at least, or on your feet. So
yeah, I'm one of the few people. It makes me somewhat guilty to say that my life hasn't changed very much in the last.
Well, yeah, I think it's, especially in games, I think it's I know film industry friends of mine are definitely struggling in some respect, because you have to physically film, but then with games, yeah, the production doesn't really stop because you can still get to a computer screen, so that can still continue. So yeah,
we're very lucky to be able to work, and I feel like my son is keeping me employed, actually, because he's become a real good at Hearthstone. You know.
Okay. Well, also it's one of my favorite games, Hearthstone. I've played it for, I think, probably since its inception. Were you initially involved in the kind of overall, just the musical theme? Were you one of the kind of main composers on that project?
Yes, I've done pretty much all the in-game music and the theme for Hearthstone.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great.
That was you know, now I can't remember the first year, but it's been going.
It's been a while, so yeah, it's definitely going a while.
It's been a great privilege to work on that project. Well, others over the years, for sure.
Of course, yeah. Well, you can kind of take us back, because we talked about this kind of off air before we started recording, but you know, you got your start by going to Harvard, right, to study game audio. Was it specifically, or was it just electronic composing? Or
no? Well, in those days, I hate to say how long ago it was, but let's put it this way: I missed the opportunity to see the Clash in Harvard Square, which I'll never forgive myself for.
Oh God, yeah.
But yeah, in those days, games were a game called Zork
Right.
that
Okay.
that you could play on a PDP 11 Digital Equipment Corporation machine called a PDP.
Right.
And it was strictly in the, it was strictly a niche thing that the geeks, the MIT types and the engineering types
Right.
were all in on it. And I actually went to Harvard to major in physics, and
Oh, wow.
and I was and got interested in that. But the thing was that I had sort of a conversion experience sophomore year, as people will have.
Yep.
And I realized that I had spent a lot more time. I had spent a lot more time doing music when I'd been younger than I was sort of giving myself credit for, and that
Right.
it didn't really think about it, and until weeks would go by when my guitar was sitting next to my desk, but it wasn't being played because I was too busy doing problem sets.
Right.
So I had this one. I had several sort of kind of moments of realization that year, but one of the big ones was Yo-Yo Ma was actually a music tutor at the house that I was in. They call them houses. Basically, it's a big dorm,
Right.
So he was a music tutor at that time, and no one had heard of him yet. It was like, this guy, he's gonna be the world's greatest cellist. This was
Right.
the word, and he was right there in our house, and he gave a free concert one evening, like a Thursday evening or something. It must have been a Thursday evening,
Right.
because I had a problem set due the next day, and that concert was down one flight of stairs from my room, and I could have gotten up, walked down one flight of stairs, gone through some oak doors, and sat down, and been about as far away from Yo-Yo Ma as I am from my keyboard right now. But I didn't do that. It was kind of like I didn't see the Clash either.
Yeah.
I didn't do that because I was too busy doing my problem set, and it was due, and it was really hard. It was due the next day, and I was probably going to pull an all-nighter on it, and I just couldn't take the break to go see Yo-Yo Ma play. That in the moment, it didn't really sink in what a messed up set of priorities that was, but it became clear that where my sort of heart and soul were headed was different from doing science, and so I took some time off and actually played music in the streets, as a busker, and had various odd jobs, and sort of got my head together, you might say, and came back and made music.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Similar story, I think, for people in general. I know there's always a time where, people will have dreams or ideations that they want to go do one particular thing, but then of course do something else. So, I know for me personally, I don't want to talk about me in this podcast, but for example, I was an engineer until I was 28 years old. And then I left that because I watched a lot of the documentaries at the time that were coming out, including the Double Fine one for Double Fine Venture. And I left my job to go chase my dream of working in games, which I'm now experiencing. So I went back and retrained at university as an artist, and now I'm doing that. So, I definitely feel like it's more, back then you feel like it was weird, but I think it's very commonplace now for people to have, like a career for 10 years and then switch and then do something completely different with their life. And yeah, I think it's very, I know there was an article years ago about a police officer who got sick of the grind of being a cop and actually put himself through medical school to become a doctor.
Wow.
Because he wanted to really save people and didn't feel like he was doing it as a cop, so done it as a doctor. So yeah, it's
well, yeah. Actually, a good friend of mine who is orchestrator for has been orchestrator for a lot of Double Fine titles that I've worked on. Worked with him for a good long time. Kareem El Mahmoudi, he's a fantastic orchestrator down in LA, and he actually quit his job at eBay. I don't remember when it was. Probably around 2000. That's 20 years ago now. But he had a full-on career as working at eBay as an engineer, and he just left it and went to USC Film School, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
And hung his shingle, and now he's an orchestrator, and he's a fantastic one. So it really is. You can't.
More commonplace.
Yeah, you can. If you don't like what you're doing, it is possible to change. Sometimes, it can be a lot of hard work for sure, but it's worth it if that's really where your
passion lies.
Where your passion lies, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's very commonplace when you see people leave those kind of jobs. I mean, one of the most famous ones I think we talk about is Alec Rickman, who's now passed, the great actor, but he was a graphic designer in London until he was in his 40s, and then he left that to become an actor.
Wow.
And one of his first major roles was Die Hard. So I mean, it's like these things can happen. You just have to believe that you can change your life. And
right.
I think it's always one of these things when I bump into people in the street now who I went to school with who are like, oh, you still in the railway, you still work as an engineer. And I'm like, no, like last time I came back from Lightbox, like, I've just came back from LA. I was just, doing a tour of Blizzard. I'm working on some games. And I'm like, oh God, so I'd rather have those conversations than a lot of people who are just like, just working along, same thing. So, when you look back, I think your legacy of stuff you worked on, it's always, you've kind of got to pinch yourself sometimes to think, wow, I've really got to work on some amazing projects. And that's the thing I kind of want, when I'm looking back, is to think, what did I get to do with my life? Was it interesting? Was it something that I was proud of? So, and of course starting on something like Monkey Island, you maybe thought that, you were going to eventually be working on all these different titles, but was that an idea you had when you were changing your major? Did you want was games an interest at the time, or
no? There's about a 6-year gap there. I mean, I took a year and a half off, and then another semester, so essentially I graduated 2 years late, and I wrote a sort of a thesis of songs that I recorded with my housemate Michael Land, and then I had a diploma, and and I had that kind of employment, and it was actually quite a long journey for me. I got a job out of school working for a company called Lexicon, which they still a version of them, I guess you would say, makes black boxes that musicians play their instruments through. And
okay, right, yeah.
So if you go to any, when I go into Skywalker Sound and I go to the control room and the big stage, there's a Lexicon controller still there because Lexicon reverb is still kind of legendary in the big studios.
Right.
And so I had since the music diploma wasn't great for getting, I hate to say it, wasn't great for getting a job, but the technical know-how that I had acquired as a physics major did help some, and so I was able to get this job at Lexicon, and I worked basically doing audio programming for reverb units. It's something called the PCM 70. I worked on that, and a couple of other boxes that Lexicon made at the time, and that was really, it was my first real job, and I was essentially an engineer, and so in some ways it was kind of a walk back because I had left the world of physics to study music, but I was still trying to figure out how you actually get paid being a musician, and I kind of wanted to be a rock star, and that is people do become rock stars, but it's not always obvious how to do it.
Yeah.
So the next best thing for me at the time was to write audio software, which was at least connected to audio and got you in touch with people who are doing music, and to have a band, outside of work. And I had a band that Michael Land was in again, and we both worked actually at Lexicon, and then he went out west. He came out here. That's in the Boston area. And he came out, and we were going to start a band together out here with another friend of his, Clint Bajakian. And but he also needed to find gainful employment, so he answered an ad in the paper for an audio programmer for this little company called Lucasfilm Games. And when I came out, by the time I made it out here, it took me a little longer than him. He was basically starting the audio department there, and he said, you got to come see what I'm doing because it's pretty interesting. I'm doing this. I have to write a new music system for this game, and I write the music for it. And so at the time, I was still doing sort of what you might call consulting work for Lexicon, but I came out and saw the beginnings of Monkey 2.
Wow.
And I was like, wow, this is really cool. And he's like, I can't do this alone. I need some help. And plus, if you get a job here, we'll get to write some music for this. And I thought, wow, actually getting paid to write music was just, I mean, really the only professional music, and now I'm 30, so I'm not not super young anyway. Really the only pay that I'd ever received for doing music up to that point had been playing in the subways in Boston. So I was like, wow, this sounds great. This is fantastic. And so I interviewed and got the job, and we started working on this system together that eventually became the iMuse system. And really, it's Michael's brainchild, but I provided some pretty valuable design insight that was based on the code that I had written. Or not really the code, but the approach to it's kind of a technical thing, but in a game there's a host software, and there's sort of the game or the music system and drivers beneath that, and in a reverb unit there's a master processor and then a subordinate processor that and those two things talk not in a fashion not unlike the host and the music system. So I was able to that sort of way of working was familiar to me. Not to get too technical about it, but that was a contribution that I was able to make to had to do
the system at the time.
Yeah, exactly. So and that's something that we developed over some years, and we brought in a really fantastic programmer named Michael McMahon, who, helped build the whole
flesh it
out. Yeah. And it took maybe 5 years actually to get it, and it's more or less solid.
I was going to say though, because for me, particularly when I do 3D art, I mean, I do feel like in that realm of creativity, you have to almost be using both sides of your brain, right? You've got the creative side, but there's a technicality to the art as well. So, there's menus, there's buttons, there's systems. So,
yes,
did you feel like your origination in physics or understanding in engineering, was that something that helped build a path for you to program music within games? Do you think that was something that helped you along the way?
Well, absolutely. And I mean, it's kind of a cliche to say, the old connection between math and music, but it's definitely a thing. And it's especially when it comes to composing or creating a structure, and so and what we kind of thought of ourselves as doing, and Michael I think felt the same way about this, that we were essentially building a sports car that we would then get to drive.
Right.
And so that's, and it really was more about the driving part than the part. It's like a very interesting problem to solve. The problem of how to do interactive music. They call it adaptive music now, and I still use the term interactive for reasons I won't get into right now. But in any way, adaptive music was an interesting problem to solve, and with the technology of the time, but it was really a means toward an end, and we were. Our goal in doing it was always to make it as intuitive for the composer as possible, because when it's 3 a.m. and you have a deadline the next day, the last thing that you want to do when you're trying to write music and get it to work in a game and is to slam over into into your left brain and start writing a C script. Which was what we did in some of the early incarnations of the system. So we always were trying to make it more user friendly and more artsy, if you will. And there are a number of systems today that are sort of carry on that torch in a big way.
The same tradition of what you've done. Yeah. I mean, if you could break it down to kind of layman's terms for people who maybe have played the games but no notice what was going on in the background, what was the kind of theory behind iMuse? It was almost like a dynamacy, right? It was the instruments would come and go in the score as you entered or left different locations. Was the kind of base of it? Yeah.
Yeah, there were two things about it. There was which instruments came and went, or which parts were playing at a time, and then there was also where you were in the piece. So there were musical ways to jump around in the piece that were based on the musical structure. They're measure based or phrase based, so that no transition would seem to be jarring or harsh, but it would simply our metaphor for it was the pit orchestra, and I played in a pit orchestra for the musical Bye Bye Birdie when I was in high school, and which is a really great musical if you haven't seen it.
Yeah.
And I was in the violin section, and so you have a score in front of you, but every so often, the conductor will. The orchestra has to lead the people on stage, but it also has to follow them. And there'll be situations where the conductor will be like, okay, we're playing this vamp, he probably would give these instructions ahead of time, but play this vamp until I give the signal, and then we go to the next thing, right?
Right.
And that until I give the signal and then we go to the next thing is kind of the heart of what the iMuse system was all about. So that you are changing the music according to what's happening on stage, but in a way that also follows the score. That's like, okay, when we get to the repeat sign, that's when we're going to jump to the next thing.
Right.
So that was kind of our metaphor for that. We definitely took that as far as we could take it, given the technology of the time and stuff.
Yeah. Was that something that was also implemented back in, or you had a chance to revisit when you done the remastered version of Monkey 2 and the other systems that were using similar structure? Did you get to revisit or reinvent that wheel?
Well, the remastered version of Monkey 2, I wasn't that involved in. To be honest with you, that was Jesse Harlan and Will Roget, and who are both fantastic composers. They had some. They essentially wanted to take the music that was already written and make it and come as close to the sort of MIDI versions of the music with live music as possible. I was one of the performing musicians on it. I played a little bit of improv violin for Bessie on Monkey 2 remastered, but other than that, I wasn't really involved in that particular release.
Yeah, I mean, I take it. Well, you've obviously had this career, obviously, where you got to work on a lot of the originals, but then was there a few you got to revisit? Was it mostly through Double Fine? So stuff like, I'm trying to remember specifically what they'd done, but it would have been the Full Throttle remaster was one, and Grim was the other, right?
Full Throttle, Grim, and Day of the Tentacle.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, was it weird going back to those projects almost 20 years later? Like, was that something that, was it like riding a bike again? Like, did you find your feet really quickly, or did you have to put yourself back into that mindset?
It was kind of like, oh boy, there it is, just like yesterday. What's funny with some of the Day of the Tentacle stuff, like some of that older material, like Day of the Tentacle and Indiana Jones 4. Not so much Monkey 2, but like I said, I didn't really work on that with Double Fine. The funny thing was, in some cases, we couldn't remember who wrote which tune.
Oh, right, okay.
The thing that I didn't really mention was with the early LucasArts years, when Michael brought me on board, and then we also brought Clint, the Michael's friend from high school that we were going to do the band with, and instead we ended up doing what you might call the LucasArts band, and and we had for Indie and Monkey and Day of the Tentacle, and to a lesser extent, slightly on Sam and Max, but that was mostly Clint. Was Sam and I did some on that anyway. But on these earlier ones, we had sort of a way of we wrote together. We wrote as a trio. So we and now typically we would have spheres of influence. Like I think my island was Booty Island and Monkey Island. We had sort of places that we were mostly in charge of, but we would actually even share tunes like the Largo. The Largo theme was something that Michael and I wrote together. Right. It was sort of like he came up with something. It needed a bridge, and actually the bridge ended up being him, and the main theme ended up being me. But anyway, it was like we would sort of toss things back and forth. If someone was stuck, someone else might do some work on it. Right. But we were all three, mostly we wrote our own stuff, but we were all three working together on these scores, and had, and this was also true of X-Wing and TIE Fighter. We all wrote, we all wrote cues, and just kind of intermingled them. And Indy 4. So that was the way we started, and then we after I think it was probably after Indy that we sort of started to divvy up the projects and have one project be one composer and one project be composed by one composer. And so Sam and Max, I think, was a transitional title, and Full Throttle.
One of my favorite plug and click adventures, I think, was ever with Sam and Max. Yeah, really good.
Crazy world. It's really awesome.
And Full Throttle as well. Like, I think Full Throttle was one of the few where the music was almost like a main character itself, right? Because it was a biker gang, because rock was, part of the life of those guys. Like, music for that especially was like the Gone Jackals, for example. That Gone Jackals theme is like, that's almost recognizable in itself outside everything else.
Yeah, we're so lucky we didn't get Soundgarden. That's what
I know. I remember hearing that story when you told it, and I was like, "Oh God, that would have been so good." Yeah,
it would have been cool, but then it would have been like, the music wouldn't have. It's just the Gone Jackals is more. ultimately they hold up as being more raw and more directly connected to the soul of the game. I mean, Keith, the band leader, actually did drive the demo tape up to Lucasarts on a bike. And I remember, so obviously being impressed with that. Here's this guy, with the leathers and everything and all black.
Yeah.
And pulls up on the bike and finds a cassette tape. And I still threw it in the pile of cassette tapes. And would listen to the tapes while I was, we had a pile of demo tapes from a bunch of bands locally.
Right.
And I was driving to my own band rehearsal and popping them in, and I'd pop one in, listen for a few seconds. It doesn't take long to know whether you're on the right track or not, and throw them out. Pop them in. And I remember I popped one tape in, and then it was and it's like, okay, I think this is fun. And it was Keith's tape that he drove up on the bike. So not only was I impressed with the presentation, but even after a blind taste test, as it were, he really came out as being the right band for the game.
Yeah, I could imagine. Like it's you say to yourself with the whole Soundgarden fiasco, but I don't think that game would have lived with anything else but the Gone Jackals now. It almost is like it would seem like you're robbing it of something if you took that away. Almost like, there wasn't, for instance, with Grim, there wasn't anything particular band-wise or big. Well, it was kind of like big band, but it wasn't band-wise. But then the whole jazz era of that, the kind of Casablanca feel, that was something that was almost in itself, again, a main character. The whole dramatic, like the whole epicness of the score, the crescendos, and in fact, that would come in to stuff you were playing. But then, that whole jazz soundtrack was something that I think has lived through the whole Grim experience, right?
That was definitely, that was an awesome project to work on. Let's see, where do I start?
Exactly. Where do you start?
the theme that you mentioned. So there are really two components of the score. There's sort of the orchestral component, which was honestly a big disappointment in terms of how it was realized, because we had a certain budget, and here I was writing orchestral music supposedly, and but we had to play them back on. We had to sort of record it on sample synths,
right?
And that wasn't, it just wasn't optimal. But I still worked hard on that component, and Tim had given me his collection or loaned me his. I borrowed it for way too long. His collection of noir films, Humphrey Bogart films. So, which was The Big Sleep, Treasure of Sierra Madre, and Casablanca. And I just watched those three films over and over and over and over again. And there's definitely some influence of Treasure of Sierra Madre in the Grim score. And I actually I wrote or called Warner Brothers in LA and got them to send me some copies of the original Max Steiner themes for Treasure Sierra Madre, and just really sort of immersed myself in that music, and so what we did with that was sort of a mock-up, you might say, of the sound. Whereas the jazz stuff, the other component, we could actually afford to do live. And you mentioned there not being a particular band. In a way, there isn't a particular band, but in a way there is, because the band in Grim Fandango is the Mission District of San Francisco in the early 90s. And during that time, funny thing, actually, Keith Karloff from the Gone Jackals actually managed one of those clubs. He was a night manager of one of those clubs, that Up and Down club. But there were all these clubs in the South of Market that played either acid jazz or straight on swing.
Right.
And you could literally walk from, you could walk into one club and there would be acid jazz playing. You could walk down the street and there would be the Red Hot Skilletlickers, which was an incredible swing band. You could go to another club and Ralph Carney, who's Tom Waits' reed player, he'd be playing with his band, and he's no longer with us, sadly. But he played on the score, and you could go to a taqueria if you were hungry, and there'd be a mariachi band playing, and that's how I got the mariachi band. So it was they're basically all the musicians who played on Grim. With the exception of Hans Christian, who's the cellist and a friend of mine, and I've worked with over the years. All of the jazz musicians were literally walking distance apart in those days.
Wow!
On a Saturday.
Yeah, there's just, that whole soundtrack. I think Grim especially, I think, is a good example because there is such a range, we talked about the big band moments or the stuff that is the high end themes, but then there's also stuff like for instance, I'm going to, through the magic of Zencastr, I can play this track really quickly and talk about it a bit. This is one of my favorites that's called Mr. Frustration.
Yeah.
Takes you back.
Yeah.
Such a simple melody, I think, and such a simple part to even a downtrodden place in the game where you're not really paying attention to much, but the music always is pushing you forward, is making you think about where you are, and that one particularly is something I can have on in the background when I'm just thinking or studying, and it does transport me, I think, to probably where you would want people to be, right?
Yeah, I'm very fond of that tune. It is simple, although it sort of starts in the middle harmonically, which I always like. So when I hear it now, I think of the players on it. In particular, the drummer, a guy named Paul von Wagenigen, who was or von Wagenigen, who was a Bay Area drummer and toured all over. Tremendous player. He's also no longer with us. He passed away some years ago. The trombone player is a guy named Dan Armstrong.
Wow.
And then there's a second solo played by Bill Ortiz, who's for many years has played with Carlos Santana. So it's
cool.
Real, some really amazing Bay Area musicians on that, on that track. And that's just one of those things that when some of those performances I hear now, and it's like, wow, because I've had the opportunity to record a lot of great live players since then. But there is something about those recordings, I have to say, even now, even though we were recording on a 4-track Pro Tools system with, or maybe it was a 4-track Pro Tools system, and in our little studio, it just what the result that we got was just so wonderful. Also partly due to the guy who Jeff Clement, who engineered everything, had worked at Russian Hill Recording for a number of years. There's a real rich legacy of and tradition of musicians from the 60s on in the Bay Area, and a lot of them are gone now, sadly, but some of them are still around, and it's just very, very lucky to be able to work in I'm very lucky to be able to work in such an environment.
Such amazing musicians, yeah. I know the feeling. I think every piece in that whole score, especially in Grim, I think sets you up for whatever's coming forward. I know the one again I'm about to play is the start of what is the second part of the journey when Manny takes over his own casino. These Casino Calavera stuff, again, coming from a drummer side of it, I was always listening to these along when I was playing as well, because I'm also a former musician. But like, yeah, a lot of these big pieces, these big band pieces, these were just, like I said, they were main characters themselves. They were pieces that, you know, you knew your time and place in the story. You knew where you were dramatically with them as well. So, I mean, there's just so many, right? I mean, it's hard to pick just one song that probably defines the entire soundtrack. But was there anything that you particularly found was your favorite particular, or one track that you still come back to or remember?
Well, certainly the one, Mr. Frustration. There's a tune called High Tone Fandango. I've always been a fan, always liked that one. The one you just played, Casino Calavera, of course, is kind of like the trademark song, and it's almost, I think a lot of people think of it as the theme of the game because it's just so sort of representative of Manny and
right,
that year,
the culture, Day of the Dead, yeah,
and it's very it's peppy, and I'm very fond of that tune as well. And I was really glad that when we did the remastered version, that I was able to bring some of my favorite players in to extend it and have a couple of extra solos, because that was really cool. To be able to
High Tone Fandango is one I'm not 100% familiar with, but again, it's
yeah,
I can hear it. Yeah.
Well, it's what you hear when you're going outside at night.
Yes.
And that's Bill. Let's see. And then Paul Hansen will come in and play the track. He plays for display now.
Yeah, good tune.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Just was so much fun to make that. I guess to make that record, to do that score. And
well, I mean, it could be in itself. It is in itself. I think the soundtracks of these games sometimes live on in themselves. You know, people can not maybe even appreciate the game, but the musical score is something that I talked about this with Darren Korb when we talked about Supergiant Games and Bastion when they made that game way back in the day. I know the first thing I heard wasn't about the gameplay; it was the soundtrack that people were talking about. Right? It was the music. So, and I think it is something, you know, I can throw on in the background and still enjoy it, you know, without the game running. I do think of the soundtrack of Grim as being, you know, well, pretty much integrally knit with the game, and so much of that. I mean, the whole idea to do jazz, I think to some degree that came from Tim. And, right.
Of course we did some indigenous music as well. It was something where I didn't want to try to pretend that culturally I was someone I wasn't. So we did do a little bit of Andean music and the mariachi tune, of course. And we have a charango, which is that Tim's brother gave him. It's an instrument that's made out of an armadillo shell.
Oh wow!
That little bring that you hear every time you change screens or whatever. That's a charango. And the charango, I think, plays in the mariachi piece as well. It's the charango, and if I remember right, it's charango and guitar and guitarón.
Yeah.
But in any case, it's it's a very unique sort of folk instrument. But I didn't really dwell on that aspect of it because it was more like a noir take on the Day of the Dead. So I was kind of bringing noir into it, which is a world I'm a little more familiar with, inspired by. So that's kind of where the jazz came from. I really owe a lot of that to Tim. He's just a real visionary. Yeah, I mean, definitely, it's one of these things where, like I says, the soundtrack will live on in infamy. But then I think it's not only that the fact that there was a soundtrack, it was the fact that you were also at the helm. You were one of the main influences of it, and I think Grim wouldn't look the way it looked, or maybe feel the way it felt without Tim, but it wouldn't sound the way it sounded without you. So I mean, it's definitely
I mean, you owe so much to Tim, but I think that Tim owes so much to you in the same respect that, his games have always had this amazing presence because of the sounds of the world that people live in. So, yes, it's definitely one of these things. I mean, you're talking about, the cult classics and the stuff you've done at Lucasfilm. When was your first journey to Double Fine? Was that with the first Psychonauts? Were you involved in that early on? Or
yes, that was pretty much. Well, we all in 2000 was when 2000 was when the Phantom Menace came out, and there were a number of us who had been longtime Lucas folks. I mean, really 10 years. And Tim and I were there about the same period of time. And Michael Land and Clint and so when the Phantom Menace came out, there'd been a whole big, huge push to release the first prequel, Star Wars prequel, and which we had all been involved in. And when it came out, it was just kind of a natural time for people who wanted to sort of try something new and kind of find their way in the world to go out and do that. And so that's what Tim did, and I left with Michael, and Clint took over the department for a while, and then he also went independent as a composer. And it was just a transition time. I mean, we worked there. Many of us, Tim included, worked there much longer than one tends to work at a company in these days.
Right.
So we were ready to change. And Tim, I actually did a internet startup with Michael, which we both lost our shirts in. But a large part of the funding came from me writing music for games. So, so writing music to support your high tech startup is usually not the way it's done. It's a little backwards, maybe.
Right. Okay.
But that's what we did, and so during that time when I was doing the startup, Tim founded Double Fine and started working on Psychonauts, and I, immediately got involved pretty much, almost from day on. As soon as I was, gainfully, as soon as I was a self-employed dude, I went to Double Fine, and we started working on Psychonauts 1, which, it's such a wonderfully creative world. It's completely. I think Psychonauts in some ways is it's just so incredibly original in terms of what it is, what it's about, the world that it evokes, so it was really, really fun to work on. We had some budgetary limitations because we were, at that time Double Fine was basically literally working out of a garage where people parked their cars and then climbed up some wooden stairs to a cubicle that was exposed to the auto fumes. I hope Tim doesn't mind saying this.
The early renegade days of game making. So
it was quite renegade, and the garage had a big that big garage door that's in Full Throttle. It's got the puzzle that you have to solve with the dog.
Oh, yeah, with the padlock.
Yeah. And anyway, the garage door really bore an incredible resemblance to that particular garage door in Full Throttle. It was kind of funny, but anyway, that was the early days of Double Fine, and we were all kind of operating on a shoestring and looking forward to bigger and better things, and fortunately, with a ton of hard work and a lot of years, that happened.
Yeah, I mean, no to kind of skip ahead, but I mean, there is one in particular that, for me, it's one of the key factors that made me leave my job when I saw the documentary, and even with the Kickstarter launch. But if you walk into the world of Broken Age, right, that was a big step for not only you as a composer, but also for Tim as a game maker, right? Because the whole Kickstarter thing, the whole self-funding, that whole, what seemed like forever, right? But it's about 4 years.
Yeah.
We kind of know how it started, that Tim had the idea to back his own games, but was he talking about that to you earlier on about composing, or was that something that, did you come after the whole setting up the whole Kickstarter and the self-funding? Were you not late to the party, but was Tim no wanting to bring you until he knew that he had work for you, or?
Yeah, well, I mean, you definitely you don't want to get the composer involved too soon or too late.
Right. Yeah. Because I watched the documentary. So you came into the project, I think, not long after the art jam, right? The guys had been there, Scott and Peter, and the guys had been in jammed, and then he brought you in to have a look. And
well, if I remember correctly, there had been, I had been aware of some buzz about this was going to happen, and I think, and Tim can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was like a guest at the Dice Awards or something like that, and that's when he announced that's when he announced Broken Age, which I think it was just called The Adventure Game or something like that at that point, but
Double Fine Adventure.
Adventure, thank you. And so he announced it, and I sent him like a little email, I think, during the awards saying, "Hey, congrats on announcing the new game," and he just responded back, "So you're going to write the music for it?" And I'm like, "Yeah."
Well, of course.
So
is that a thing though? I mean, just in general, I'm trying to wonder that, is Tim's world something that evokes something special in you that you've not found with any other games? Because I know sometimes you can get fantastical worlds in most games, but like you say, Tim's are very unique. So is there something about his games that brings out a different composer in you?
There is, and it's kind of hard to explain. I don't think we've ever talked about it. I don't think, to be real honest, we've never worked that closely together. Tim leads by example, and he's very much a sort of less is more approach to creative leadership, and I think he leads through example and inspiration. So for Grim Fandango, it was like, here's the art, and I want you to watch these movies, and let's see what you come up with. And for Psychonauts, it was, here's this really cool gypsy music or music, Roma music of there was a particular record or CD by then, but a CD that I listened to over and over again, that was kind of inspirational, because Raz's family are traveling performers, and in terms of the working relationship with Tim, it's always been, he certainly lets me know if something isn't working, but it's really very there seems to be some kind of understanding that I can't explain. And in terms of his uniqueness, I once heard one of an operations manager at Lucasarts called Tim the Orson Welles of the business, and I think that's a really apt description in terms of the level of art that Tim does, and it's something that for me is very special, and so I do appreciate the tremendous good fortune that I've had to work on his games, on his vision, and his stories, and his writing, and his crazy imagination.
Yeah, and of course now you're joining them again. You're involved in Psychonauts too. So, I mean, it's like coming home every time, right? It's like a familiar, like a warm place, or fuzzy place in your heart, where it's maybe where you do your best work because you feel that fuzziness, you feel that uniqueness, and especially for Psychonauts, right? Because I mean, it's even stranger, I think, the fact that Tim creates these unique worlds every time, but Psychonauts is one of the few where you're revisiting somewhere, right? You're coming back to somewhere you've already you've laid down foundation for that sound, and now you're building on top of it, so to speak.
Well, it's in a way it's even better than doing Grim Remastered because I get to write a whole new score, and we've got a little bigger budget this time around than we did for Psychonauts 1. Of course, big budgets don't always make for the best music. You never know. But I will tell you that I am just super psyched about what we've been able to do, and we've had involved. We've had the involvement of Melbourne Symphony Orchestra again in Australia, and some fantastic players in Nashville, and we've got a song that we did with Jack Black, which is I'm very proud of, and so there's it's just I really feel like in so many ways, and I'm very, very, I have to say, super grateful to Microsoft. Thank you, Microsoft, for buying Double Fine. And I think I speak for everyone there as far as I can tell. Yeah. Just like, oh my goodness, where would we all be now if that hadn't happened last year?
Yeah.
And so we're very, very fortunate to really be able to give this game the attention and that it deserves, and the score, the scope that it deserves. And I'm just psyched, just really jazzed. And we're still doing it. We're still working on it.
Of course,
we're not done, but we have done a lot of really nice recordings so far. Really killer recordings.
Pleased with it. Yeah, I think it's always it was apt the way Tim described it when he put out that almost comical short video where he was like, it was all black and white, and he's like, "Yeah, Microsoft came to us and said if we wanted a bunch of money." We were like, "Yeah." I mean, it's pretty. I mean, what else can you say, right? That's the only selling point you need. So, I mean, for me personally, it was a bit weird because I know when they done that short documentary with 2Player about the original Psychonauts and that whole when Xbox let them go, Tim having that conversation, trying to relive that moment where he had to stand in front of everybody and be like, "There's no money left,
right?
We're out of money. You guys can stay here and keep working if you want for nothing." Or he's like, "Oh God," you can actually see people starting to relive that moment, talking about it being, you can see them getting emotional again because they can remember what that felt like the company was almost closing at the end of that game. And then of course Majestico came back like last minute and bought them, but or helped fund the game. But it's like, it's weird when I thought them going back to Microsoft, almost felt like, well, why would you after the way they treated you? But then of course, why should the sins of the father pay for it? It was a different company back then. It was a long time ago. The world was different. The way business is done is different. And especially, I've always said, since Phil came in to run Microsoft, or run Xbox, sorry, I felt like he has been a gamer forward kind of mentality and definitely has put that at the forefront. So, I think that's why I could see why now Xbox would be a thing they would want to get involved in, and Microsoft especially, because they are very game focused, they're very entertainment focused, they're wanting to put their studios first and make great games. So, although I had mixed feelings, I was like, oh no, I can understand why. And of course, Tim doesn't want to spend the rest of his life constantly chasing money and constantly chasing funding and trying to get his ideas off the ground. He wants to have that financial backing and that kind of helpful hand from Microsoft to fund these projects. So I think it's a good move overall. I think me and Lee spoke about it at the time when it just happened, and Lee was the same. He was like, I think it's a good move for studio.
Absolutely. I mean, what Tim told me is that he actually did a fair amount of due dil and talked to other people who had been acquired. And so Tim is a rare combination of being a tremendously creative person and also really a very good businessman. He really considered it very carefully, and like I say, the result is just I couldn't be more pleased with, and they, not to speak for them, but the impression I get for Double Fine is that, phew, oh man.
Well, I mean, he did talk about it at the latest E3 video they put out, where he was like, I did speak to studios, and they did say, like, they give you money and just let you get on with your projects. They're not micromanaging you. They're not looking to interfere.
Right.
They just want to help you make the best games you can make. So if that's the consensus, then yeah.
And I think also it's, at least as far as I can tell from Tim, that it has relieved him of the necessity for being, a globe-trotting frontman half the time for a company, rather than, it actually lets him make games now. And I think that's, I think that's going to show with Psychonauts too, that how, the full force of Tim and the entire team's creative potential, because, like I said, he does lead by example, and I think it's really what's going on with this game is really, really cool.
Tim's a shining light in this industry. He really is. Like he's one of these guys that even outside the games, before I got involved in the industry, he was someone I definitely looked up to, and someone actually reshared a Twitter post that was Tim at one of the Game Awards, and I can't remember which particular one. He had a tux on, and he was talking about something at the time. I'm assuming there was some kind of thing going on in the news, and he was like, I wanted to just say it here at the awards show just to reiterate, if we weren't very clear in it, but fuck white supremacists. and I was like, yeah, like that's the kind of guy Tim is, right? He just puts his heart in his sleeve, he says it all as he sees it, and he's always championed, like even the recent blog thing they've been doing online on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
They talked very, very concisely about crunch, and about, he was like, we don't want to do crunch, we don't ever want to put people in that position again, because he lived through the first Psychonauts, right? He understood what that done to people, how people were still living with that years later. So he's like, never again, never ever again. So that also is, for us, especially as like me as an artist, that is a thing I fear in games industry, is that it is very commonplace to make people crunch and stuff, and people's lives are ruined over it, right? It's a very, especially for you as a musician, right? You all have also deadlines that have you up late at night doing stuff.
Well, I put in 3,000 hours working last year, so I can tell you that there are we do work hard, and it's not my goal to put in those kind of hours, believe me.
Of course,
it's I think you're either in a sprint or you're in a marathon, and I'd much rather be in a marathon
in the sprint. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely there's a 90s mentality of making games that's carried through the last couple of years, and I think we're seeing now the death rattle of it. We're seeing the end of what used to be game production, and now into the new generation of companies actually giving a shit about people. So I'm glad that at least we're coming into that kind of scope now, and people are starting to understand about, like, you have to have a life outside of your work. You want to have some kind of mental health equilibrium, and you don't want to constantly be working. And I think it's also a bit worse for you because you're in the freelance gig, right? So you're saying yes to everything at one point because you don't want to pass up work or pass up an opportunity to make money because you need to pay your bills like everybody else. So whereas people who are maybe in full-time positions at companies or have a Monday to Friday kind of thing, they're still working hard obviously, but then they don't have to depend on going out and chasing the work, right? They have the work come to them. So
well, it goes way back. It goes way back, to the. I mean, it's a thing in high tech in general, but I remember one of the LucasArts execs said, back in the day, said, "Hey, you can work any 60 hours of the week you want." And honestly, 60 was on the low side.
I was going to say
some of those for some of those projects. Anyway, it's we've all got to learn to get a little balance into our lives, especially when you get to be, when you're around for a while like I have. It's like,
Well, my realization in between projects right now is learning piano. That's my
great
because I've done every other instrument. I used to play in drums and guitar and metal bands, and even screamed or sang at one point. But then now I'm a bit mellow in age. I'm 35 now, so I'm slowing down a little bit. And I've always wanted to do the piano. I've never ever learned it, so it's my new project at night. I'm trying to learn some.
Good on you, my friend. And graduation day, 1984, the day before graduation day, 1984. There were still two members of the music department who had not passed their basic piano exams.
Wow.
One of them was Michael Land, and the other was Peter McConnell. I was the last to pass.
Yeah, and there you go.
It was a gift, let me tell you. I try to. I'm a little better than I was then, and it's also my goal to be a decent piano player one day.
Yeah,
because it sure does help.
It takes a while. I've definitely seen. I mean, we were lucky. The guy I was talking about, Sean, one of the guys I'd done the game jam with in November, he was a professional level pianist when he was 15. He was playing for people, and the rich people in the parlors. He was doing the jazz piano in the background when he was 15, 16 years old, and now he's in his 20s. And when we got to make Tomato Mare, which is our game, I'll send you the soundtrack. He's got the soundtrack up separately, but he wrote a whole jazz inspired piano piece for the 3 levels we done, and he wrote them in 2 days, and I can tell you it was some of the best music I've ever heard in a game. It was incredible. Yeah, I shall pass it on. Sean, if you're listening, I know you're probably losing your mind right now, but I will send Peter your work. I'm sure he'll love it. So, yes, indeed. Okay, so Peter, I'll let you get on with your night because, of course, like everybody else, you have work to do. I'm sure you're busy with whatever you're working on at the moment. Of course,
we got to do some guitar tracks today. Yeah,
fantastic, awesome, great. Thank you for coming on and giving up your time. It has been a real pleasure to talk to you about music.
Well, thank you, Gordon. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. For anybody who's still listening, thank you for making it this far. If you want to reach out to Peter or check out any of his work, I'll leave all his links in the description. You can check out all of his socials, his website, and anything he's worked on. His music is far and wide in the games industry. I'm sure you'll be able to listen to something. And if you have any comments or questions, leave them down below. I'm always happy to get back to people or pass anything on to Peter if you want me to ask anything specifically. But thanks to you guys for listening. Thanks to Peter. Check out our links below also. We have a Discord at the moment that you guys can get involved in and share your work. A couple of other links for the podcast. We're on various podcast services, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iTunes, and of course we're on YouTube. So just check out any of the stuff you want, and hopefully you enjoyed it. We'll speak to you guys later. Thanks again to Peter, thanks again to you, and we'll speak to you guys later. Bye guys.
Bye.